we are in a different universe than we were last week, but this universe is called universal dependencies. It's twice as many universes as just in the title. And the talk will be given in English.
Thank you. So my talk today will be about morphologically and syntactically annotated corpora, and especially about harmonizing these sorts of annotation across languages. And I gave here a talk on this stuff last year. Many of you were here, and I believe most of you have at least some idea about what is universal dependencies, which is the project that I will be talking about most of the time. But I will give some brief introduction anyway, and gradually you will see that I will be shifting towards what we are now going to announce officially within a couple of days, which will be the version 2 of the Universal Dependency Guidelines. And I also have some stuff about issues specific to Slavic languages, but here I will have to see how fast I am, because I definitely have more than what I have time for. So let's see. So let me start with a motivating example, which is probably almost becoming a classical one now. Suppose we have 3 dependency structures for 3 sentences. You don't see the surface word forms yet. There are just part-of-speech tags, but these are 3 identical sequences of part-of-speech tags, but 3 different syntactic structures. So just from this picture, you might expect that these 3 sentences are pretty much different syntactically from each other. Because of the structures, they are really not too similar, right? If you compare number 1 and number 2, there is just one shared dependency relation, and I'm not showing you the labels of the dependencies. It's just there's the arrow. There are 2 shared between 1 and 3, and there is nothing in common between 2 and 3. But this looks a bit odd, doesn't it? Because even if the same sequence of part-of-speech tags could have different readings and different meanings and different syntactic structures, you would probably not expect it to be that different. And you would be right, because when I finally show you the underlying text, these are exactly the same 3 sentences in 3 different languages. The languages are fairly related to each other: English, Danish, and Swedish. And the differences we've observed really are not differences in the structure. The syntactic structure is the same, and just the matter of how you decide to represent it. So in this case, this just happens to be the last one is annotated according to the guidelines of the Swedish Tolvanken. This is the does it work? No. This is the Danish dependency tree bank, and the first one is one particle conversion of the pen tree bank into dependencies. But this is really a huge problem, right? Because that means that we have different annotations for the same thing. And if we train a parser on these 3 tree banks and compare the results and get some numbers, the numbers really don't, the comparison of the numbers really doesn't tell us anything. Because it doesn't, we might think from the numbers that maybe Danish is more difficult to parse than Swedish or than English, but what really we would be observing would not be differences in the languages, not even differences in the domains from which the texts come, but rather just differences in the design decisions behind all these annotation styles. So that is a problem not only for parsers. You can't even think about any parser cross-lingual model transfer or things like that we also have been trying to work on during the past decade. And even for linguistic research, many of you are linguists, and you create queries, you query corpora online, and as you clearly see here, you can't just create one query that would be applicable to all the 3 tree banks. You would have to study the manuals of all 3 and then convert it accordingly. So people have observed that this is a problem and have tried to do something about it. This is a list of initiatives that I'm aware of, and I was involved in some of them, not necessarily exhaustive one. There was a project of mine called Interset, where I tried to work on conversion of different morphological text sets. Somewhat similar but restricted to the base part of speech category was the Google Universal part of speech text set. Then we had the Hamlet project here in Prague, where we converted even the syntactic structure to the Prague dependency tree bank style. Then there was something similar in Google, but it was based on Stanford dependencies. And finally, about 2.5 years ago, most of the people behind all these efforts got together and finally started to work on one common standard that would be applicable to hopefully all the languages and all the tree banks that we can get. And since then, we had several releases of actual data. We had all of them were at least supposed to adhere to version 1 of the universal guidelines from October 2014. But now we think the time is ripe to look back and think about what could have been better, could have been designed better, and possibly change the guidelines for the upcoming release number 2 in the next year. So I will now give you the promised introduction. I will try to do it rather quickly. As I said, we try to find something that is cross-linguistically consistent and would support multilingual research. This is an important point. We want to base it as much as possible on things that people already use and like to use, so that we don't have to persuade them to use something new. So whenever possible, we try to base on existing standards. That's why we resorted to Stanford dependencies, because they were already quite popular and used in some flavors in many tree banks. We used the Google part of speech text, even though we extended it. And last but not least, we used the file format called CONL after the well-known shared task in parsing. We also should always stress that we are not a new linguistic theory. We are really motivated or driven mainly practically, even though obviously we want to be linguistically informed and consistent, relevant. We also don't claim that UD is the ideal representation for parsing, although in the meantime, there have been experiments reported, and the results revealed that actually it's not so bad. If you have UD and you try to train a parser, it's not a bad representation either. And we also don't claim that this is the union of all the annotation scheme that will cover everything that you want to annotate. Rather than union, we try to be sort of intersection and define a lingua franca for what people usually want to have annotated, so that they do annotate it the same way. So actually, if we say universal, it is universal in this sense, that we try to design such a scheme to which you could convert most of the existing tree banks without losing too much information. It's not universal in the language typological sense. We had some controversies with language typologists. So you really should not read it as that we describe the language universals, where the typologists probably might not agree that such thing exists at all. Design principles, we are based on dependency. I don't think I have to argue too much why this is useful. We are based on the lexicalist hypothesis, which means that the basic unit is a word and not a morpheme or something smaller. But I have to stress here that we speak about syntactic words, which sometimes has to be put in contrast with orthographic words. Sometimes we have to split orthographical words into 2 or more smaller units, because they are syntactically independent, and usually these are contractions where you could not easily even say what is the part of speech of the whole unit. But when we do this, we also very much try to do everything in transparent way, so that it is encoded in tree bank, and if you segment the word, it should be, you should be able to take the tree bank and learn a model for the segmentation if it's not something trivial, and be able to apply it to new data, because that's crucial. Sometimes you have corpora where there is some strange sort of tokenization and the tokenizer is not available anymore, and you just can't get the same data from new running text, so you can't reproduce any results in tagging, parsing, etc. So we try for this not to happen, so that we have everything encoded there. As I say, we try to annotate the same thing, same way, and vice versa, not make different things look the same. But it's not always as easy as it may sound. Sometimes it's quite difficult to delimit to what extent phenomenon A in language A is the same thing as phenomenon B in language B. So sometimes there are really heated discussions about this, but that's the price. We try hard to achieve the parallelism across languages, but we don't claim that it's always 100% possible. And we allow language-specific extensions, because even though we define what is the intersection of all the annotation, which should be applicable to many languages, we still admit that there are other phenomena that people would like to annotate as well, and that are just not covered by the universal part, so they should have a mechanism how to edit without breaking the universal interpretation of the core. So we have three layers, essentially 3 layers of annotation. The lowest one would be the word segmentation layer, but I'm postponing that as the last item in on my agenda. So I will start in the middle with morphology. I don't think there's any surprise for you there. There are word forms. The words have lemmas, and they have part-of-speech tags, which are from the rather limited and coarse-grained set used for all languages. But whenever you need to represent any other grammatical category, you have a lot of available features and feature values for that. As for the part-of-speech tags, we use what is an extended version of the originally Google Universal Part-of-Speech Tag Set. They had 12 categories originally. We have 17. And here you already see the first deviation from version 1. So for those of you who were familiar with UD version 1, the first change we propose now is renaming coordinating conjunction from conj to C-conj, because that was causing confusion when compared to the dependency relations and other things we have there. So this should be a minor thing that should be easily fixable in all the tree banks. This taxonomy is really meant for all the languages to use. They don't have to necessarily use all of the categories, but they are not allowed to define anything extra here. If they want anything extra, then they have to do it using the features. For the features, we have originally 17 feature names, and you can view these as dimensions of grammatical meaning. Each of them may have one or more values. Some of them, like the case, have more than 20 different values defined. And the tree banks or languages can define additional values, and they can even define additional features if they need to. Here again, this is the version 1 of the feature set, and negative has been renamed now. The version 2 will look like this. We have added 4 new features, and we have renamed negativeness to polarity. There might be more in future versions, but this was just what we observed in the existing tree banks, what they used frequently as language specific, like marking that a word is foreign word or that its abbreviation is not really specific to any language, right? It was just specific to some tree banks that decided they care about this distinction, and because there were quite a few of them, we decided that this should be standardized so that we ensured that all of them use it the same way. Yes? Evidentiality. So, okay, that originally I had this covered in tense. In Turkish, you have two versions of past tense. One of them is what I would call the default unmarked past tense, and the other was for non-first-hand statements. If you reported about something that you heard that should have happened, but you didn't observe it yourself. So you would have to use a different morphology for that. And then we found out that actually there are many languages which have many more dimensions or many more values to this dimension, so that they have different morphology for what you observed yourself visually, or what you heard, or what you had second hand or third hand, and so on. So even though right now we only need this one value for Turkish, we decided that this seems to be something typologically broadly used in many languages, and that it should be separated. So on the syntactic layer, the main principle that we try to follow here is that the backbone of the dependency structure is based on the content words. And that's because it will give us at least the hope that we can maximize parallelism across languages. So in this case, we have 4 content words here: cat, chase, dogs, and street. And these are connected using the blue links. And the rest, the function words, are just like decorations attached to the content words to which they belong the most, or to which they modify. And these are the red links. And then there is punctuation. So this actually means that this has been causing a lot of controversy too. Some of you have attended the DepLink last year in Uppsala and have heard heated discussions about this, whether this is appropriate or justified or not. So I really would argue that you have to interpret the links here, including the labels, not just look at the arrow and the direction. But without the type, it doesn't really tell you anything. You can't interpret it as that one word governs another word. So it's not dependency in the strictly governor and governed sense. So, okay, now you may wonder, I told you that universal dependencies is not really universal and it's not real dependencies, so why do we call it that way? Well, we just do. It's a fancy name and we are not going to change it. So if you don't like it, I would suggest that you just go by UD and maybe substitute it with unified data or something. But never mind. I would like to a little bit push more the case for the parallelism and for why do we think that content words are important. Let's consider this example. We have an English sentence here: the dog was chased by the cat. And the Bulgarian counterpart: kučeto se presledovaše od kotkata. And as you can see, these 3 content words are perfectly matching, and the backbone of the tree has the same form and same relations. While obviously the function words can be parallel because there are not the same number of them in the 2 sentences. And it often happens that what is expressed or encoded by a function word in one language may be expressed by morphological features or by nothing at all in another language. So here we have the definiteness feature is encoded in the definite article in English, and it's directly a feature of the noun in Bulgarian. We have the past tense in the auxiliary in English, but it's directly in the content verb in Bulgarian. But if you slightly change the Bulgarian version from the reflexive passive to periphrastic passive and say kučeto beše presledované od kotkata, now you have the past tense here as well. And finally, if I change it to a Czech counterpart, you see that we don't even have definiteness at all. The tense is again encoded in the auxiliary verb, and the right-hand part by the cat was both in English and in Bulgarian encoded by the prepositional phrase, but here it is encoded just by the instrumental case. So while you just see the strategies encoded here, you see the instrumental case and you see the prepositional phrase up there, it doesn't directly tell you that it's the demoted agent of the verb, even though actually there are 3 banks that have a special language-specific relation for that and would tell you here. the tree still is parallel. So those things that are encoded the same way in the two languages should look the same. So we have a taxonomy of universal grammatical relations. I can't tell you how many exactly we have, because originally there were 40 different relations in Universal Dependencies version 1. Now it seems that there will be 38 of them. Some of them have disappeared, some of them have been renamed, some have been even added. But because the discussion is still running in the emails as we speak here, I just noticed that they are trying to convince the rest of the core group to remove one more relation. So this is really not fixed yet. But it should be fixed really within a couple of days, because the tentative deadline is December the 1st. And there are language-specific subtypes. You've seen already some of them. And they are organized along various dimensions. So one of them is that we distinguish dependence of clausal predicates from dependence of nominal heads. So these are just the clausal predicates. The red ones are new or renamed ones. So I will not go into details unless you ask me in the discussion, because I don't really have time for all of it. So one of them is that one of the changes is that we are now removing specific labels for passive constructions, but we are not removing them completely. We are just shifting them to the language particular area. So originally you wouldn't have the colon there, and the colon means that from here on it is an extension of the subject label. And sorry, the other dimensions along which you could organize the labels or the relations are that we have core and non-core dependence of the predicate. And so subject and object essentially are the core arguments. And we distinguish whether the dependent itself is nominal or clausal or something else. And we do the same distinction for dependence of nominal. So again, a modifier of nominal could be nominal itself or clausal or other. So clausal, it just means ad nominal clause, the ACL abbreviation there. Coordination in version 1 of UD was known as something that people often call the Stanford style coordination. So you have the first conjunct as the head. So here is obviously the advantage over the Prague approach is that the whole thing is represented by something of the same type. The disadvantage is that you wouldn't really want to say that these are on different levels, but never mind, I'm not really going into details of this. Stanford style coordination was widely used, so we just went for it. In Stanford, everything else, including the conjunction and punctuation, was attached to the first conjunct as well. We are now slightly changing this in version 2 and reattaching these elements, the joining or delimiting material, to the immediately following conjunct, because that better corresponds to what we are doing elsewhere in UD. But otherwise, the coordination is still attached to the left head, to the first conjunct. I will be talking about it a little bit more later. We also have a number of relations which might suggest that we are doing something with multi-word expressions. One of them was even called MWE in the version 1 of the guidelines. It was not exactly what we meant by that. We used the MWE label just for very fixed expressions where we thought that really they should be treated as one syntactic word, and maybe if it was allowed to have words with spaces or with underscores or with something, they would be even collapsed into one note. It was not always understood the same way by all the tree-bank contributors, so sometimes they used the MWE for very large and variable phenomena, including idiomatic expressions, which could have various morphological variation and so on. So that's why we tried to fight this misunderstanding by renaming the relation to fixed. And we have another one called name, which also caused confusion because it was used usually for joining first name and last name of a person, or maybe parts of foreign geographical term or organization name. But many people understood it as if we were doing named entity recognition and using it for everything which involved a multi-word name. And on the other hand, there was a confusion of whether we could or should include words like president, Mr., and so on. So we are now changing not only the name of the relation to flat, but also changing the definition to any nominal that is just flat, and you don't really know or don't have strong arguments for making one of the words the head over the others. On the other hand, compound is meant for something where you know what should be the head and what should be the dependent parts of it, and goes with is just for wrongly edited text to put it together. If I said that we don't permit words with spaces, it was actually true until now, but we decided to slightly loosen this ban in version 2, mainly because of Vietnamese and maybe other languages, but I really don't know any other language working the same way, where they have the writing system where the spaces really don't separate words. They separate just syllables. So it's essentially just like Chinese, but because instead of Chinese characters, you have the syllable composed of several Latin characters, and then there is a space and another syllable. So that's why it doesn't make sense to have these as separate notes in Vietnamese. So if a language, and as I said, I believe there's maybe no other language than that, if a language explicitly says that the writing system works this way, then in that language, the validating software will allow spaces inside of word forms and inside of lemmas. Probably we will allow also very restricted list of cases in other languages. Hot candidate is numbers in Czech, French, and other languages where you have spaces inside of the typographically correctly written number, and it doesn't really make sense to make these separate notes. There have been proposals that some cases of multi-word abbreviations should be included as well. I personally am not a fan of extending this possibility very far, but let's see what happens. Definitely, we say that it should not be done freely to anything. It should be sort of approved by voting or something. We have a couple of other relations, which I don't think I should go into details now. Again, there is one removed now and one introduced instead, and you will see details later on. And as I said, language-specific relations are possible, but in this case, you have to define or have to say what is the base universal relation of which your extension is a subtype. You can't just define a new string as a label, so that it's possible to ignore the part from the colon on by anyone who just doesn't care about your extensions. And finally, as I promised, there's the lowest layer of annotation is the word segmentation. Again, I stress we really want it to be reproducible on new data. There's actually always a technical layer of tokenization where you separate punctuation from the words and so on, but this is meant to be really something that can be done without a dictionary, without morphological analysis, by really low-level tools. But then in many languages, it is necessary to separate parts of words as separate syntactic words. Our usual example is the Spanish one down here. Vámonos al mar contains two contractions. One of them is preposition and article. Al is pronounced and written as al. And we wouldn't have any part of speech tag for that, so instead of defining all possible combinations for all languages of fused part of speech categories, instead we just split it into two words, two syntactic words, and attach each of them separately. Same thing is with clitic object pronouns attached to main verbs. So vamonos is split to vamos nos, and here you also can observe that we don't necessarily require that the concatenation of these two forms gives you the surface form. So the surface form is encoded there separately, but it is possible, and it actually makes sense here because these two are really word forms that can be used in Spanish elsewhere, but just if they are used in this context, they have to be merged. We have the same thing in Slavic languages as well. So the Czech naň would be an example where we should do this. I didn't see any occurrence of that in the Prague dependency treeback, surprisingly, but I know we have it in the text set. Russian izmenятся should probably be split into two parts, even though I believe we don't do it in Russian right now. Polish has a similar stuff, and so on. So, so far it was mostly the introduction to UD, although already extended by various changes that we have proposed for version 2. I tried to summarize the version 2 changes on this slide, but most of them have been at least briefly visible on the previous slides. But these two in the middle deserve more discussion, because these were really the most difficult phenomena or topics for us during the past few weeks, and there were heated debates about it, and I think it's not the end of story. We have come up with some proposal which is somewhat acceptable to majority of the people, but it's not large majority, so the discussions are likely to pop up again for the next version. So nonverbal predicates with copula or without copula are one of the problems. And actually we agreed that if we could ban copula in all the languages, and if we could ban coordination everywhere, then life would be really easier. So as you know, some languages use a copula verb, like in Ivan is the best dancer, is copula. In some languages, you could observe a pronoun instead of it. So in Polish, you could say Ivan to najlepší tancerz, and to is pronoun, but it functions as the copula here. And in some other languages, you would not see the copula at all. So in Russian, you would say Ivan lучший танцор, and the copula is not here. So that's why we decided, and copula actually is a function word of a sort. So following our principle of putting content words up in the tree, we don't treat the verb as the root in this phrase, even though it's a verb. Instead, we take the nominal predicate as the head, and this is just attached as a function word to it. The obvious advantage of this is that we now get parallel structures here. We only don't see the copula here because it's not here, but otherwise the structure is the same. But so far so good. But yeah, so far so good as well. Actually, in Russian, you could see the copula in past tense and in future tense. So thanks to this approach, we even have a parallelism inside of Russian between past tense and present tense. But unfortunately, there are problems to that too. One of them is that traditional grammars would often tell you that besides the main copula verb, there are several others that are pseudo-copulas, or whatever is the term, which usually add some hint of other meaning to that, but still they are semantically weak, and their main function is still to link the nominal predicate with the main one. So to stay in English now, Ivan is the best dancer, and Ivan became the best dancer, will no longer be parallel in English, because it's not clear where should be the boundary, what is still copula and what not, and how would we achieve the cross-lingual parallelism. So we decided that the boundary should be very, very soon. Probably in most of the languages, you would have just one copula verb. So in English, we say that to be is a copula and to become is not a copula. Another problem is, if we agree that to be is a copula, what usage of that verb still counts as a nonverbal predicate and what doesn't. So if you say Ivan is the best dancer, it's probably clear. If you say Ivan is today in Moscow, it may not be so clear. In the current English UD3 bank, you would find that this is analyzed as copula as well. In the current Czech data, you would not find this analyzed as copula. It's mainly the legacy of the Prague dependency tree-bank annotation, where we just use these as adverbial modifiers. And even if you decide that, and we did decide for version 2 that locational phrases should be treated as predicates, there are other problems that have to be solved. One of them is visible here. There might be more than one adverbial in the sentence. So probably, I believe that most of you would agree that in this case, the real predication is about the Moscow, and today is just the modifier. It may not be so clear always. If you say the show is today, then okay, today is the predicate. If you say the show is today in Moscow, well, I'm not sure. So there will have to be some hierarchy or what comes first if you don't know what to use. So that has been one source of discussions whether it's worth doing it. So, but on the other hand, you have the original motivation of being parallel to the Russian construction. So if that motivation is valid, then it's probably valid here as well. And finally, this just popped up last week. I wasn't aware that we had this problem in English. But now even in English, you probably will no longer be parallel between copula in sentences like this one and existential constructions like this one. I personally would be quite fine with treating this as a copula construction or locative construction or whatever as well. But the truth is that existential constructions are considered something special. So I believe now the consensus, or at least the position of the English team, is that they will annotate this as a non-copula verb. So it will stay as the root. I'm saying it's likely, but as I said, the email discussion is still running, so I really can't guarantee what will happen in the next release of the data. But the proposal for the universal part of the guidelines is that existential constructions should be annotated the same way as the locative constructions if they are syntactically the same, which opens the door for English to say that this is not the same syntactic encoding of the sentence. The final problem, I think final problem with copula is that sometimes you have a clause there. I didn't really find an example of having clauses on both sides, but if there is like equation represented by the copula, and there is a nominal on one side and clause on the other side, you have essentially two possibilities. One of them is the clause is the subject. We could have clausal subjects. This is actually what would happen in the Czech conversion from the Prague dependency tree bank. So the problem would become the nominal predicate. I don't think they want to do this in English, because in Czech it doesn't matter really. We have the free word order, so we really sometimes have the subject on one side and the predicate on the other side of copula. Sometimes it's reversed. But I think in English they want to have the first element always as the subject and the second element as the predicate, which is a problem if the second element is a clause, because then it would have two subjects, one inside a clause and one outside. So you would have one subject. If this was the main, missing. If missing was the main root of the sentence, then one subject would be he and the other subject would be problem, and you could not really distinguish the two. And theoretically, probably you could recursively do the same thing inside here, so you don't even have the guarantee that it will be limited to just two levels. So because of that, there is another exception that if the sort of nonverbal predicate is a clause, then we can't analyze this as copula, even though we acknowledge that it is a copula, and instead we use the XComp relation which essentially says that this is a complement, but there is a secondary predication as well. So in the enhanced representation of UD, which I was not talking about so far, we could have another link going back here, but that's extra. So that was about copula. And the other really thorny issue, as Joachim named it, is coordination, and somewhat related to that is ellipsis. As I said, for coordination, we still have almost the Stanford-style coordination, except for the conjunction and the comma. But essentially, still the leftmost conjunct is the head here, even though it's probably just artificial head. There are languages, though, that are prevailingly left branching. So the rightmost word is usually the head in most of the phrases. And these languages, or the people behind them, would argue that you should do it reversed way in those languages. So you should take the last conjunct as the head here. Turkish is one of the examples where they argue that the last conjunct usually takes all the morphological inflection, and sometimes if there is gapping, that it happens on the left side. So it's essentially, most of it is reversed to what we see in English and Czech and other languages. So far, they still did not convince the rest of us that it should be allowed to have different direction of coordination in different languages. Again, if I just should tell you my personal view, I think that it would be sort of okay if it was in one language that way and in the other language the other way. But if it was definitely the same way across all the data of one language. But it doesn't seem to be the majority opinion at the moment. So quite likely in version 2, it will still be required that all coordination structures are left to right. Even though actually if you look at the current data, and currently it's also not allowed to have it left branching, and you look into Turkish and Uyghur and Kazakh, and I'm not sure about Japanese, you would realize that they actually do it this way. So maybe we should allow it just to make it consistent, make the guidelines consistent with the data. The other half of coordination-related problems is with ellipsis. Ellipsis could occur anywhere, but this is arguably the most difficult case. If you have coordination of two or more predicates, and actually the second and subsequent predicate is a copy of the previous one, and it's not overtly expressed in the sentence. It's just understood there. So if you say Kate went to Florida and Jay went to Europe, and maybe Martin went to Asia, and so on and so forth, and you don't see the second went here. So the problem here is that you don't know what to do with these orphans. You don't know where to attach them. And while in simpler cases like missing noun in a nominal, you can just promote one of the dependents to the head position, and it usually doesn't hurt the rest of the tree. Here, it really is not clear whether you should replace the predicate by the subject or the adverbial or whatever else. So this is the problem. Some tree banks, I could name you a couple of examples, would use just an empty node or null node to represent the parenthesized went, and that would solve most of the problems. It has downsides too, but definitely it would be a solution here. We originally did not allow empty nodes in UD at all. We now, in UD version 2, allow empty nodes in the so-called enhanced representation, which I just mentioned a slide ago, but I am not going to describe the details here. Essentially, enhanced representation is a parallel structure where you could even get something more than a tree. You could get a complete graph if you thought it was adequate for the sentence. But the question here is, what are we going to do in the basic representation? Because again, the enhanced is an extension. Most of the users will not care about it, and many tree banks will not even use it. So what do we do on the surface level? One possibility, and that was the approach taken in UD version 1, was so-called remnant relation. Essentially, you linked the orphans to the corresponding arguments of the first verb, which were present here. So Kate corresponds to Jane, and Florida corresponds to Europe, and they were linked together. As you can see here, there's a drastic non-projectivity there, and it was not even applicable in all cases, because sometimes it just happened that you had only the second part as a separate sentence or segment, or just one of these was not present as well, so you would not have any possibility where to attach it, so we abandoned remnant in version 2. The question is, what should we do instead of it? If you know the Prague dependency tree bank, this is the solution that we would have there. We have the XD relation. Essentially, this means that we attach the orphans to the grandparent or to the closest available ancestor in the tree, and we use a special label of the relation which doesn't tell you anything more than just beware, this is something weird. This should not be trusted. There is a slightly more elaborated approach in the ancient Greek and Latin dependency tree banks, where they are also based on the Prague dependency tree banking scheme, but I have converted here to how it would look in UD environment, where they encode the whole chain, whole path through the missing node to the orphan. So you have both relations here, conjunct and subject, and conjunct and oblique argument. That was one of the proposals for version 2, but it's not going to win at the end. And the winner probably is this one, where the reasoning here is that and Jane to Europe is sort of constituent in the sentence, even if there is a gap in it. So we want to keep it together. And we also want to be able to distinguish if it happens that there is more than one empty node in the sentence, like virtual empty nodes. They are not really represented here. We would be able to distinguish between orphans of one empty node and orphans of the other empty node. So this is probably going to win. This is, again, just a technical relation that tells you we had to put them together, and this is not a real linguistic relation between them. But if there is the enhanced representation, you could still trace the empty nodes and all the what was happening there, and you have the constituent together. So arguably, it should be more readable for users. Whether it's true or not, we will see. So that was what I have about the version 2 changes. So where are we now? I believe that we finally managed to create a snowball effect, so that really people believe that if they have data for a language, or if they have a language for which they want data, it's good for them to have it in UD. Not necessarily as the main representation, but at least they should think about possible conversion from their data to UD. So after the 2 years, we have had 5 tree bank releases. The last of them happened just a week ago. We try to do it every 6 months, even though the next one will probably be earlier. We currently have 64 tree banks. We only started with 10 tree banks in January 2015 for 47 languages. Ryan McDonald tried to calculate approximately how many native speakers it covers, and it's already over 50% of world's population because of Chinese, obviously. We have over 12 million tokens, but there are huge differences between individual tree banks. Some of them are lower than 1,000 tokens, and some of them PDT is over 1.5 million. We have over 140 contributors, which I personally find as one of the greatest achievements, because we really created a community where people collaborate on this. And as I said, version 2 guidelines are almost ready to be launched. And last but not least, there's going to be a kernel shared task, again organized mostly by people from UFAL and some others, shared task in parsing UD, which will be next year. The Connell conference will be co-located with ACL in Vancouver. So if you have anything to do with parsing, this might be interesting to you. So, how much time do I have? Still something. This is just a snapshot of the website, but it's 1 month old and it's already outdated because we already have more languages there. So where are we going? Besides the things that I already mentioned, one very important thing and probably never-ending fight is trying to check consistency across languages. It's great that we now have the lingua franca, that we have a set of guidelines, set of common labels, but still people can understand the guidelines in different ways, and sometimes people are really very creative about finding their own explanation of the guidelines. So we have to look into data and keep looking there and try to find out phenomena that possibly are the same thing into languages but are not annotated the same way. And then if we believe so, then we have to discuss it, and maybe the contributors will argue that it's not exactly the same thing. So it will go on forever. We have now focus groups on various language groups. We are trying to achieve consistency first within these language groups, and hopefully when it's done or when it's close to what we can achieve, we may shift this one level up and maybe join together Indo-European languages and try to find inconsistencies there and so on. So let's see what happens here, and I will now give you the promised last part of the talk about the Slavic specific issues. I will have to go quickly or skip some of them, but hopefully we have time for part of it. So currently there is about 15, maybe more, tree banks for various Slavic languages, at least those that I'm aware of. Most of them are already converted into UD. This table is not only those in UD. So maybe, for instance, the Croatian HOBS tree bank has not been converted yet. Some of them, like Slovak, are larger than the part that we have converted into UD. And there are some others, tiny, that are being worked on but are not yet ready here. But nevertheless, there is a lot of data to play with. I think I should skip pronouns and determiners and get directly here. One of typically Slavic issues is quantified phrases. In UD and in many tree banks, the default approach is that if you have a number and noun, counted noun, the number is treated as a modifier of the noun. So that's why it would look like in UD, if you say one kitten slept, there will be the nummod modifier of the kitten, and that's it. It would be the same way even if converted from PDT until you get over 5. If you have 5 and more kittens, then the morphological behavior in Slavic languages changes. Essentially, what happens here is that the numeral requires the noun to be in the genitive case, even though the whole phrase behaves as if it was nominative, or even if it was accusative, if it was the object, it will still be the same thing. So one might be tempted to change the direction of the arrows here so that this is governing the kittens and this is the head of the subject phrase. That would actually achieve parallelism with nominal phrases like this. You say group of kittens slept. You have, again, here is instead of the number 5, there is a noun that again requires this to be in genitive, and otherwise this noun happens to be sort of quantifier as well. So it is really even semantically similar, and there is no doubt that this should be analyzed the way you see here. But you can't achieve both, right? You can either have the parallelism between these two, or you can have parallelism between these two, but not all. And so we decided that for UD, it's probably better to have these two parallel, because even though there is this problem with the genitive case and with the governor versus governed node, we've already done similar stuff with prepositions and other thing in UD anyway. So as I said, the direction of the arrow doesn't really tell you the whole story, and we can even define a language-specific extension of the label here, which will signal that there is something strange here with the governing the case. So now, even though this is analyzed as the leaf node in the tree, we still have the information that in this particular case, it was governing the genitive case here. So that could be used for whatever you would be looking for, because those of you who speak Czech, you know that not even in all the cases of the whole phrase this happens. If it was an instrumental, then it would be a different story. It behaves the same way if you have pronominal quantifiers, like how many kittens slept. So we analyze it very similarly, only the difference here is that the main type of relation now is determiner, because the pronominal quantifiers elsewhere in UD are analyzed as determiners. Sorry. So there is this small taxonomy where we have two base relations, det and nummod, and we have several extensions which allow us to distinguish whether noun governs the case or numeral governs the case, and whether it's numeric or pronominal. So that was one issue that I wanted to cover. Another issue is, what do we do with verb forms? And essentially, you could observe similar problems with other forms as well, but verb forms are very versatile and display various combinations of features. So we can demonstrate a lot of them. The first problem is whether participle is verb or adjective. In some languages, people would say that it's more verb than adjective. Somewhere they would say the opposite. Sometimes they would even split it depending on type of participle. Same thing with transgressive or converb or adverbial participle, whatever term you prefer. Some people say gerunds in Slavic as well. But the real problem here is, there are actually two problems. One of them is stated here. We can only add features to individual words, while some of the terms in grammar apply to groups of words. And the second thing is that the traditional grammatical terminology in these languages really differ. So there are conflicts, and you can't just take one term and believe that it means the same thing in all the languages. Example. These are from Slovenian, and all these are the so-called L participles from Slavic languages. So vracali is a participle, but the red thing together is a past tense, so se vracali. Another L participle in different context can create conditional mood, by prišli. So far, it's something you should know from Czech as well. The third one, probably not. They can, in Slovenian, use it also for future tense. So bodo vozili together is future tense. But that doesn't mean that you can say that vracali, prišli, and vozili is either past tense or future tense or conditional, because it's just a participle that's used depending on context for one of these grammatical constructions. You could say that this is conditional mood because it's probably not used for anything else. You could say that bodo is a future tense because that's the auxiliary that's only used for that. You would have to say that so is the present tense because it's a present auxiliary, but together with that participle it creates the past tense. So the question is, how do we mark this participle? The problem is that we have to mark it somehow. We just can't say just that it's participle because we have other types of participles in Slavic languages. So we want to distinguish them somehow. It's usually called L participle in Slavic literature, but that would mean we would have to create a Slavic specific label for that, which could be doable, but so far we didn't go that way. In Czech, we could say it's active participle, which means you would use the voice feature to distinguish it, or you could say it's past tense, so you could add the the tense feature, even though it's not so clear from conditional, but I personally would be okay with that, saying that it's past participle, even though I use it for present conditional as well. But I don't think it would be okay for Slovenian, because future tense and past tense doesn't seem so compatible. On the other hand, in Bulgarian, we need to have the past tense there versus imperfect tense, because they have two subtypes of the participle, of the L participle already. So this is, I'm not providing a real solution here. This is just to demonstrate that even within one group of relatively closely related languages, not everything can be standardized on just one set of guidelines. Sometimes we just have to diverge. And probably the most visible diversion in the current data is that in Russian and quite likely in Ukrainian as well, this participle is not even marked as participle, but it's marked as finite verb, because there is no auxiliary in these languages. So they just were not satisfied with my suggestion that it should be participle in the sake of cross-Slavic parallelism. Another, and I believe it's the last thing I can cover, another difficult problem is what to do with the core arguments. The original idea, at least as conveyed by Chris Manning and others, is that we want to stick with the language typological approach that many languages have these three roles available and encoded somehow. There is a subject of intransitive verb, there is the agent of transitive verb, which in Czech happens to be essentially the same thing, and then there is a patient or direct object of transitive verb. What exactly this means might be maybe clearer to people with more linguistic background than myself, but when I tried to study the literature for that, it was not completely clear to me whether this should cover in Slavic languages anything else than accusative objects. But if it doesn't, if it shouldn't, then it's not really clear what we should do with them. Because then we have also indirect object, but that's only meant for verbs where you have two core arguments and not just one. Some examples. In English, even in English, I don't really find this as a perfect parallelism, because they have, he gave John the book. In this case, John is core argument and it's labeled as indirect object, but he gave the book to John is called oblique because of the preposition. So there is a different relation for that. On the other hand, the mere presence of the preposition doesn't mean that it must be oblique in all languages. In Spanish, for instance, they would have dio el libro a John, and in this case, even though there is a preposition, it would be indirect object because they agree that it's a core argument of the verb. In Czech, so far, I have just taken, you know, who knows PDT, you know that there is just one OBJ relation, and I just took, every time I saw such relation, I translated it to direct object, which is currently renamed in version 2 to just object, which sounds a little bit less controversial in Czech, regardless of the case and even regardless of the presence of preposition. But if there were more than one object in the sentence, then I decided that one of them has to be the direct object and the other have to get the IOBJ label. Definitely it's not the best possible solution, and we will still have to discuss what actually is the best possible or least evil solution. But as you can see from these examples, we definitely have verbs which have one patient, which is obligatory, even though obviously they may be deleted from the concrete sentence, and which are not necessarily accusative. So cením si vaší pomoci, I appreciate your help. It uses the genitive case, čelíme velkým problémům is in dative, and I wouldn't say that this is indirect object. Nedisponuje takovým rozpočtem is instrumental, and you can occasionally even have two accusatives in the sentence, and then one of the accusatives should be the direct object or just object, and the other should be indirect. Same thing happens in all the other Slavic languages. And now I'm really talking about data. So this happens in the current data, how they used it and how they annotated it or converted their pre-existing resources. So I have analyzed just, I guess, 6 languages. I don't know how it's in Ukrainian, for instance, because there's just new data set from the last release. But more or less, it seems that we are parallel here within the Slavic group, although I'm not convinced that we are doing exactly what was meant by the original UD guidelines. This is probably the last slide I have about this. It sort of relates to the core arguments. We have also the problem with reflexive pronouns. As you know, not only in Czech but in other Slavic languages, a reflexive pronoun can serve as a normal object. So if you can substitute it by a normal non-reflexive pronoun, like in řízl se do prstu and řízl ho do prstu, then it's object. Then there are inherently reflexive verbs, where it doesn't really have any syntactic function. We originally annotated this as compound, but then there was a meeting a year ago which suggested that all these reflexive pronouns that don't have the object function should be analyzed as some sort of expletive. So although it's not yet in the data, the correct solution here would be expel possibly with the extension of pronominal verb. Then we also have the reflexive passive. So in line with all the other colon pass extensions in the other relations, we should do expel pass. And finally, there is a special suggestion for impersonal constructions, which I believe, if converted from PDP, would probably end up here because we don't have a special label distinguishing these two. So I will skip the trees here so that I can wrap up. I think I tried to give you an overview of universal dependencies, of what happened during the last 2 years and what's going to happen in the near future. I hope I have convinced you that it's really a great project and it's worth considering if you have anything to do with syntactic annotation or searching corpora or parsing or whatever related. But there is a lot of work to do. Besides adding new languages, we definitely have to improve the existing data sets so that the original motivation that the same thing should be annotated the same way is really fulfilled, not just in the guidelines, but also in the data. So get involved. Thank you.
Before, but you have added to that conviction that it is an enormous project, and I would add it's a very courageous one. So you certainly are prepared for questions, objections, and further examples that may add to the range of problems you face. So I open the discussion.
I'd like to have just one question about tokenization. You said that when you do tokenization, you split. Sometimes you have to split words, but what you actually do, you don't split words, but you split and interpret words.
Yes.
I mean, you don't conserve on the word level, on the forms level, you don't conserve the original form, you split, but you already interpret the parts, so you don't split, for example, check nine to 2 parts, but you already say that the new is not. So
go on.
Do you think it's really necessary to start interpreting the forms at this level? Would it be better to interpret it at the level of lemmatization, but not here?
Well, it is on the level of lemmatization, I guess. You have to. First split them. I preserve the original surface form just for the sake of reproducibility of the word segmentation, but I don't annotate anything else for the original form. All the other annotation is assigned to the parts. So lemma is assigned to the part, one of the part of speech tag, all the features, and yes, that means that you actually can only do that as either part of morphological analysis. Otherwise, if it was that easy as concatenating the two parts, it maybe would not deserve the special annotation layer here. But because we are aware that sometimes it's not the case, we have to devote a special line for that and saying here was this original form. And then either you have the morphological analyzer that will provide the functionality here, or if you don't have it, at least it should be marked in the tree banks in a consistent way so that someone can try to learn a model for assigning these or splitting the words according to the tree bank.
So perhaps just it should be named or marked appropriately. So just to say, this is not just tokenization, or just splitting words, but you already add some new information which you perhaps don't.
We usually call it word segmentation, but that is a term that could cover everything. It could, in Chinese, it could cover a complex model that will find the word boundaries where you don't have any clues. In Arabic, you would arguably need a complex morphological analyzer to be able to achieve it because you often have long strings with multiple tokens in it or multiple words in it. In cases like Spanish vámonos, it would probably be much easier, maybe doable by a simple script, but still by something that's aware of Spanish.
Okay, I wish I could see the slide on control. I think you had one in Slavic.
And I skipped it.
So you had a syntactic function for xcom,
Yeah.
but that was for finite clauses, right?
No, not necessarily. It was. The definition here is that if it's a complement of a verb or clause, is a complement of another clause, and it is inheriting the subject somehow from above. So either from the controlling subject or object, but definitely it doesn't have its own, then it's xcomp. Otherwise, it would be ccomp. It usually boils down to infinitive clauses in Czech. So sometimes you could use it for secondary predication, where in Czech it would be called doplněk. So then you would not have an infinitive there. But I'm not sure. I think in some languages I saw examples where they even had finite verbs and claimed that it was according to the definition, but I don't remember the example.
So once I see it, I have another question. So this looks like a modal verb, and in English you showed modal verbs that were treated like as auxiliaries.
Yeah.
Right? So do you have different criteria for Czech and English?
Yes. That was I skipped it, but that was a long discussion already before we started with version 1. Originally, I thought because modals in English are auxiliaries, we should treat them the same way in Czech as well. But then gradually it appeared that it doesn't work very well, and it probably brings more problems than good. And even the set of verbs that should be treated as modals, I don't think it's very fixed. Definitely it's not the same for English and for Czech. So when you start thinking about it and you try to find out something else than just semantics, then it's difficult. Because I personally think that, having this parallel to měla bych tam začít čekat or chtít čekat, or to want in English is not a modal verb in this sense. So after those discussions, we decided that probably modal verbs should not be treated as auxiliaries in Czech. And fortunately, it turned out that none of the other contributors for Slavic languages objected to that, so all the Slavic languages have it the same way. I think the justification for English here is that should, could, will, can have really reduced paradigms much more than in Czech, and there are other tests that are used in English for whether something is auxiliary, like when you create a question, you don't use the do you auxiliary if that's auxiliary itself, and so on. So they have valid reasons for saying these are auxiliaries, and in that case they treat them the same way. If I go a little bit on here, I had another example in Russian where this actually is not even a verb. Mě надо vypít vody. And then if you have a similar thing in English, but instead of I must drink some water or I should drink some water, you say I need to drink some water. Because they don't treat this as auxiliary, you already get parallelism here as well. So that's unfortunately something we probably can't avoid. We try to have parallel annotation somewhere, but usually we lose it somewhere else, and we have to decide what hurts more. And obviously not all the people will agree that this was the best decision to take. We call this the catastrophe principle. You have a scale of something becoming something else, and then suddenly you have catastrophe because the annotation in UD flips to some different things. So now you suddenly have a different tree which is not comparable to the previous one. But
sometimes you can also modify the modals. So by an adverb. So that could happen maybe also with English, although I'm not sure if that could happen with should or could.
Yeah, I think I had, when we led these discussions 2 years ago, I had some negation exactly and scope of negation and so on. And when I tried to give them the examples and translate them to English, then it came up as something not so obvious in English, and because I had to use verbs like want to, which were not treated as modals there. So it's not easily transferable to the other languages. So maybe then it's a good point to say that it's not the same thing.
My question concerns the tokenization of the German compounds, such as vorals, daraus, vorals. Are these elements split into two parts and change places, or?
I don't think. They are not. Yes, I think these are something like pronominal adverbs in the German tree bank. There is always a certain degree of freedom for the teams maintaining individual languages, whether they decide to split something or not. For instance, in Czech, I tried in the beginning to do something that some of you will remember from PDT version 1, that we had these aby, kdyby split to abychom split to aby bychom. I'm not completely convinced that we have to do this in UD. We could probably live without it, but nevertheless I did it just because I remembered it was there, and it was sort of justified by the principles sketched here. And I wanted to try that it works with my tools and so on. So it's there, but if someone jumped up and said, "Oh, you should not do that," I would probably retreat back with that. So in German, I believe the German data we have is from Google. There could be a different team. We have several German tree banks which are not yet converted to UD. There is something in Tübingen, something in Hamburg, and there is a tiger corpus. Maybe there would be different opinions on that. Then obviously the most desirable thing would be to have this the same way across the language for all the tree banks. But since we have just one for German, I can tell you there is the obvious thing is zum split as zu dem and all things like that. But I think that's it. Woraus will be as one word. I have somewhere the list of. Yeah, that's. Yeah, actually, even in Czech, we have naň, because that would be a core argument of the verb, or could be. We should see the pronoun there. But if you say nač or proč, it's just an adverb in Czech. Even though etymologically it was also proco. But I don't split that. But to say that proň is an adverb, I don't think it would be correct.
If I search the corpus in the column format, is it lemmatized?
Which corpus? Most of them are.
I will need the English and Czech unique treatments.
Yes.
I was just looking at it the other day on PMLTQ. It was not searchable yet. And then I heard from you that it was in column format. And I think the column was not lemmatized, although you were speaking about lemmatizing.
There is the column format has one. That's a, for those who don't know. That's a column-based format. It looks like a table. So there's every word is on separate line, and there are tab-separated columns or cells. And so the first one is the number of the word in the sentence. The second one is the word form. The third one is the lemma. If the lemma is not available, then you will see just an underscore there. But essentially, that means that for some tree banks we don't have lemmas. And we don't require the lemmas for the tree bank to be released. So if they say we don't have lemmas, but we still have dependencies and we want it released, then it will be released. So if you look at the website of UD, there is the overview with all those flags, and there are some icons, and one of them is like circled L, which will tell you there are lemmas in here. And most of the tree banks have it, but not all of them.
Another question. I did not quite understand the problem of the different analysis of coordinations in Turkic languages and some others versus the mainstream solution. Because it seems that it goes, having it differently, which you said you would personally find acceptable, seems to be completely contrary to one of the rules that you mentioned in the beginning, that same things should be analyzed in the same way. Is there some argument that it is not the same thing if X and Y and Z happens in Turkish instead of English or Czech?
Yes, I think the argument is, or the dispute is, whether anything in coordination is a linguistically motivated head. I'm not completely convinced it is, but I see the points of the people claiming that there are reasons for that. And if we admit that these are linguistically motivated reasons for having a head, then the relations within a coordination structure is no longer just an arbitrary link. If it's arbitrary, then it should be the same in all the languages. But they say, first, if there is any inflection, like the whole coordinated nominal is in a particular case, the morphological marking of the case in Turkish will only be applied to the last conjunct, although it sort of modifies the whole structure. So they think that this is one of the reasons which say that that should be the head. Although the reply to that, at least in the beginning of this discussion, was that, okay, we say that somewhere in the whole structure there is a feature that you should read off, and you should be aware that in this language it applies to the whole structure, and it's essentially the same thing as if you have a a preposition somewhere attached to a noun, and it also encodes sort of case marking of the nominal phrase, but you don't see it directly on the head. So that was the reasoning against it. There was another problem with the right-headed versus left-headed coordination, which almost made us to propose the variability across languages for version 2, and that was the gapping argument. The example I had here was Mary went to Florida and Jane to Paris. That in Turkic languages, it usually happens the opposite way. So you could have the gapping to the left. You could say Mary to Paris and Jane went to Florida. And then if you apply the ellipsis treating mechanism, it looks really weird to see all the arbitrary links to the left and the rest to the right. But when we switched to the final proposal with the orphan link, it didn't look that weird as with the chained relations. So that was the point where we decided that we will probably keep it as it was.
A question concerning coordination, but maybe I somehow misunderstood it. Let me give you Czech examples. And maybe I am too much influenced by the grammatical layer and deletions. So the Czech example, like Alena dala babičce kytku a táta bombonieru, as contrast to Alena dala babičce kytku a tatínkovi bombonieru. In your scheme, you would have the in the first example a tatínek bombonieru, a tatínek together. In the second, you would have a tatínkovi bombonieru. But that's a different. But the coordination is not exactly inferred. So.
Well, but. The hypothesis here is that it's still coordination of the verbs or clauses, if you like, dala and dala. And the second dala, which is not overtly present there, has its own set of arguments. Once it is tatínkovi, once it is tatínek, so there is a different subject which may be missing as well. But the only answer here is that we will keep that bag together without saying much about the relations inside it. But if you have the information about the differences between these two examples and want to have them preserved, then you would have to go one step farther for the enhanced representation and include the empty note there and mark everything there. Which maybe some people will ignore it because if they will train parsers, they will decide that it's too difficult for them to learn. But you will. It's not. I'm not trying to intimidate you. I'm for keeping all the information that is available, and then we should learn how to do that in parsing, but not to discard it just because it may be difficult for parsers. But that difficulty was one of the arguments against having empty notes directly in the surface representation. And the other argument, which I'm not sure I agree with, was that having empty notes is less intuitive for non-linguistically educated users. Which I don't know, I'm no longer non-linguistically educated, but I think it's perfectly intuitive. So I don't know. But nevertheless, the possibility will be there.
Another question concerning the cross-linguistic uniformity. Among the Czech tree banks or resources you had in your table, you didn't have the Czech English poetry. I mean, that's a question, whether it might be interesting for you or for people in that
sure.
community to look at a poetry bank. Because you have, with these languages, as far as I understand, you have a tree bank for that particular language. But
the problem here is that I have done all the conversions to UD. I could easily apply the same procedure to PCEDT as well. The problem is that I only operate on the analytical layer, which in this case is completely automatic. So I don't think that people would immediately notice it, except those who know. But we generally don't assume that the tree banks in UD are created automatically. That should be probably released separately. And in this case, it's just parsed by MST parser or something. So either we need a new manual annotation, which, as I heard, is being worked on, but not ready yet, or I would have to completely rewrite my conversion script so that it operates on the tectogrammatical layer, but that has its own set of problems, because then there is no longer mapping for tokens.
Meant to tell you that this should be done, but just as a question whether it might be profitable or I don't know what, if one has a Perl tree bank and compare how
Definitely yes.
dependency work for Perl text, not for separate text.
I haven't seen any papers about this so far, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. I believe they do. We already have at least one Perl tree bank in UD, which is Swedish English, Linnes, or how it's called, by Lars Arenberg. I think sort of parallel are various classical languages there, because they have at least portions of the Bible where you could cross-link it using the usual Bible citations. So there is Old Church Slavonic, Ancient Greek, Latin, the Gothic, and maybe something else, I'm not sure. So yes, parallel tree banks are interesting, and we take them there. It could be marked as being parallel, but we still release them separately for each language, so that you can decide whether you want to explore the possibility of having parallel annotations, or just stick with all the tree banks for Swedish or for English.
There will be about 30, maybe 35 languages in parallel for the shared task.
Oh yeah, that's okay.
But this will be only like
1,000 sentences.
1,000 sentences in each language, all translated from English to the other language. So maybe but quite a number of them will be the same. And for the Czech, for the other Czech treatments, I hope they will be ready for the May 2018 release.
Great.
We don't restrict the manual annotated corpora, so we have released Czech English parallel corpus already in UD in the convoluted format, not in the newest version, which is now being prepared, but we can update to this. And I've also done English, Swedish, Europara, or we could do other parallel corpora automatically parsed. There are questions how to store the port alignments, so I'm working on it. If you are interested, you can study.
Thank you, Sasha.
Yeah, well, I just occurred to me now that are these tree banks converted from existing tree banks, or are they tagged by a tagger that is trained on some golden standard already provided in universal dependencies, or does it work in a different way?
No, well, there are. I see several questions in your question, actually. One of the okay. Most of the tree banks that are in UD are converted from existing annotation, and usually the existing annotation is manual. So there could be errors or mismatches which would be introduced by the conversion procedure not being perfect, but otherwise it should be as good as manual. Some of the tree banks, like the Croatian times HR, are directly annotated manually in the UD style. Ukrainian is the same thing, I guess. And in some tree banks, but not the Slavic ones, for Spanish, I think, and for German, we only had the manually assigned part of speech tags, and we didn't have any features and any lemmas. And we added both using tagger plus some heuristic rules that we ran partly here using tweaks. So if we saw that there were obvious problems with analyzing a Spanish verb as a noun, with the features not matching a noun, then we could do something about it. But most of it was based on statistics. So this is also a known and allowed thing in UD, that these additional annotations that might not be there at all are instead assigned by a model. But the part of speech tags and the dependencies should be assigned manually.
So is the goal to have golden standard in UD for as many languages as possible, or are you happy just with conversions?
You mean gold standard like natively annotated in UD? Well, that's obviously the best thing we could achieve, but the goal is to have as many languages as possible with these manual bits of annotation. I think that's the requirement, although we don't really have means to check it. If you give us a tree bank for Greenlandic, which will be completely automatically annotated, I think it will take some time until we get a native speaker who will object to the annotation and say it's automatic and not manual. You know, but otherwise the assumption is that at least part of speech tags and dependencies are manual.
Comment on this. I think there is a growing number of tree banks natively annotated in UD for the rarer languages. So, like in the summer school, I work with several people trying to bootstrap this. So, also using automatic tools, but manually checking it and basically starting in UD already. There are some tree banks originally in other style, but they decided to throw away their former style and keep only the UD. So, I think this is the interesting decision whether the team decides to maintain two versions of the tree bank and also maintain the automatic conversion. So like the primary will be, let's say, our prime dependency tree bank style, and we will always automatically convert it to UD. But in some languages they decided the other way around.
Yeah, I think I just heard 2 months ago about Slovenians that they said, okay, we are just a small language, a small team of people, and we don't have resources to maintain several versions, so we will probably switch to UD. But I think, at least for Czech, we are not that far that we would be able to preserve all the information in UD so that we can get back to the PDT annotation. So that's not a question for us.
So let me thank Dan again for his talk and also for detailed answers to our questions.
Thanks for coming.
And I would like to invite you for the next seminar, which is next Monday, and we will have a guest from Slovakia, Benko. And as I said, that will be the last seminar before Christmas, because the week after several of us and you will be at Korea in Japan, so we won't be here, and that's it. So thank you very much.